It's become almost verboten to discuss cause and effect, real cause and effect, and also, again, what kind of civilization you want, what kind of country you want. And we better think about that because I think we're in a fairly chaotic time, Shawn, not just in Canada, but around the world. And we better think about the kind of society we want.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Dr. Mark Milke has written more than 1,000 columns over the last 25 years. He's been involved in more than 70 research studies, and he is the author of 6 books. Mark has extensive experience working in think tanks with a focus on research and public policy development. In 2023, he launched his own foundation called the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy. Welcome, Mark.
Shawn, thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. Doctor, I wanted to start out with your book, The 1867 Project. You edited this volume with a number of other authors, and I wanted to read the very first paragraph. Quote, "Utopians have long been a problem." End quote. Explain.
One of the reasons we wrote the 1867 Project, myself and 19 other authors, is because if you look back in history and go, oh, John A. Macdonald didn't hold our views in 1867. Big surprise. It was 1867. Plus, to look back and think people in history should have been perfect makes 2 mistakes, I would say. Number one, it's immodest, as if you and I, Shawn, don't make mistakes or have error-prone views today that someone 100 years from now might think, Shawn and Mark, what were you thinking? Good question. But the other problem is looking back and expecting history to be perfect is a bit absurd, to say the least. And in previous ages, at least, we're looking to the future and expecting it to be perfect or thinking they could create a utopia. Sometimes religious communes wanted to get to perfection on earth, right? Heaven on earth. Marxists certainly did in the 20th century, thought they could create economic heaven on earth, so to speak. I suppose in their defense, if there is one, you could argue that Marxists and others were at least looking to the future, which hadn't happened yet. By definition, you can't change the past. So to expect people in the past to have been perfect, we're all imperfect. We all have imperfect information. We're a product of assumptions of the age we're in. And it's quite condescending for moderns to think that they are perfect, as I mentioned a moment ago. That's why the introduction to the book really starts with the problem of utopianism, because you end up, if you're utopian, taking down, as I put it in the book and elsewhere, but in the 1867 Project, you end up taking down the oak tree of civilization or the oak tree of the country that is Canada, going, oh, look, there is an imperfect branch in our history. That means we should take down the oak tree, so to speak, that big tree that shelters us all, as opposed to, no, you prune off a bad branch, and that's how you improve a country, your neighborhood, literally your tree. But we have people today that go around looking at history or us now as imperfect and say, let's take it down. That's utopian, among other possible adjectives and descriptions I could use.
Great answer. So I wanted to jump to the end of the book now, last chapter, and I wanted to read just the first sentence. You're talking about renewal, and where do we go from here? Page 263, you say this: "It is time to debunk a nonsensical myth that has metastasized in Canada in recent years, that any attempt to rank ideas and values as preferable or civilized is intolerant at best, racist at worst, and a sign of a misplaced cultural superiority complex." End quote. Explain.
Sure. If you're living in what, I don't know, 1000 AD, 1100 AD, 1200 AD, and you're studying Aristotle in the Arab world, while medieval Europe might think that's a bad idea, or if you're Jewish, you might prefer to live in the Arab world around that time period as opposed to Christian Europe. So there were superior ideas. Or to use a practical example, the fact that we Europeans, if that's our history, borrowed from the Arab world and actually from India before that, Arab numbering as we call it today, was a vast improvement on Roman numerals. I mean, trying to imagine to do algebra, or physics or anything with Roman numerals. It's pretty impossible, I would think. So there are superior ideas and practices out there. Likewise, let's jump to the present or near the present. In the 19th century, a much superior idea was that men and women should be free and you shouldn't be a slave because you've got the wrong skin color, right? Abolition, the abolitionist movement, introduced really in the West by Christian ideals of equality before God. Now, you can be an atheist and believe people are equal. On what basis, I'm not sure. But nonetheless, you can certainly believe in the equality of the individual or subscribe to it. You don't have to subscribe to a particular faith. Nonetheless, the notion that people were equal and should be treated as equal in law and policy was a wonderful development in civilization, in humanity. And it's a better idea than slavery. Or jump to the near present. I would submit, Shawn, that marriage of two people, men and women in most cases, is preferable to polygamy. Why? I remember interviewing someone who came from a cult, a commune, a breakaway Mormon commune from Creston, British Columbia. She had 9 children. And her husband that she left had something like, 15 or 20 wives. There's great potential for abuse when you have one person lording it over 15. There are some preferable ideas out there. Now, also, these days, we hear that all civilizations are created equal. I'm not so sure. I don't like what's happening in Afghanistan to women. I don't like what's happening under an Iranian theocracy, another theocracy in Tehran. There are certainly Iranian women who will, expats and students, obviously, if anybody reads the news, who don't agree with the Iranian theocracy. What are they saying? We prefer the freedoms developed in the West, but now, thankfully, have spread to some other countries around the world. Right. So let me give you one last example. I was in Hong Kong in 2013 on work for the then Fraser Institute that I worked for at the time on economic freedom of the world. I went there because they were trying to persuade us that they were going to remain economically free. And the institute that I was, with at that point produced this index measuring them and others. And they said almost to a person, and I talked to politicians, civil servants, business people, almost to a person. Over the course of a week, I met many people, probably 10 or 20, as I recall. Almost all of them said there were 3 things they wanted to keep: capitalism, the rule of law, including the British legal code, and anti-corruption efforts in Hong Kong that dated from the 1970s. And Shawn, I'd never heard this in Canada. I'd never heard a politician or civil servant say, we really want to keep capitalism. And by the way, the rule of law. And we're concerned about corruption and want to root it out in Canada. So that's an idea. Those are ideas. And they're a result of British colonialism, which is much under attack in Canada these days. But the Hong Kongers saw it very differently. They weren't obviously, for the most part, European. Their intellectual and cultural history was obviously Chinese, Buddhist, Confucian, that sort of thing for the most part. But they didn't care. They saw good ideas, liked them. And of course, those ideas, along with capitalism, free and open economy, led to a flourishing free Hong Kong under the British and for a while after, until it's been crushed in the last 12 years since I was in Hong Kong. And Hong Kongers were concerned in 2013 when I was there. And most of your viewers and yourself will know what's happened in the interim, where Beijing really has taken away a lot of the freedoms. And we should be not shy about saying some ideas in history and now are superior to others. But we're in such a kind of a relativistic age where it becomes, risky to say that, because it might touch on someone's faith, or at least the outworkings of that faith, or philosophical ideas. We might want to get over that and have honest conversations, because without that, you can't really, first of all, and you can't actually reform a society to what you might think is a better outcome.
Yeah, great answer. I'm going to push back a tiny bit. I actually agree with everything you've said. Having said that, aren't there some things that we really shouldn't say out loud? So if grandma does something that's just impolite or inappropriate at a family gathering, you don't call it out just because it's true. Well, you seem to be saying things that are true, but are they mean?
I don't think so. Obviously, on a personal level, yes, with grandma, if you don't, and she says, how do you like my dress? And you don't, there's no point in being honest. That dress flatters you, grandma, or it's your color. Is it a white lie or whatever? Or you change the subject to her cooking, which you might like better. But whatever it happens to be, I think personal situations are different than civilizational questions or ideas and policy. Because again, you don't get to good outcomes if you're not willing to be honest. Let me take a clear Canadian example, which I wrote about in The Victim Cult, and I also touch on a little bit in the 1867 project. Indigenous Canadians. If you look at the statistics, on average, their incomes and outcomes on many levels were lower than other Canadians. Whether East Asian Canadians, you got pale skin like you and I, Shawn, so on and so forth. Now, but the averages don't tell you much. And some people will blame this on, say, residential schools or the fact that Natives were discriminated against in Canada before, say, 1960, when they finally were granted the vote by the government of John Diefenbaker, so on and so forth. So some people will blame racism in history or allege racism now, and so on and so forth. I think the argument or the cause of disparities now is much simpler. You've got a greater proportion of what used to be called treaty Indians under the Indian Act on reserve. They're First Nations people on reserve because they have reserves in many cases. If you're what used to be called a treaty Indian in the legal concept, the constitutional concept, you've got a greater proportion of people who live in rural areas in terms of Indigenous Canadians. That's a problem because we know since the Industrial Revolution onward, incomes are lower, opportunities are fewer in rural areas. That's why people have been moving from rural areas to the towns and cities for the last 2 centuries across the world. But we have a system in Canada that encourages people to stay in the middle of nowhere in northern Manitoba. It's, for example, so it's going to be much more difficult to come up to the levels of other Canadians if you're on a reserve where you have no private property, where your educational and career opportunities are fewer. And we do know, for example, that when you do apple to apple comparisons, an Indigenous Canadian will earn exactly the same income as a non-Indigenous Canadian. In other words, the same as the rest of us. If, for example, you look at the Statistics Canada data, which we've done at the Aristotle Foundation in one of our studies, and it's also in some of the books I just mentioned, The Victim Cult and the 1867 Project, you will find that a Native Canadian with a bachelor's degree who works full year, full time, makes about the same, just slightly less than other Canadians on average, or median income rather, to be economically specific, as the economists would want me to be. If you have a master's degree or higher, though, you actually earn more as an Indigenous Canadian than other Canadians, your median income. And what does that tell you? It tells you that education matters. It tells you even that geography matters, right? Again, if you're in a rural area, your likelihood of earning a great income is lower for the most part. These things matter to idea debates and policy in Canada, but most people don't think about them. They've never encountered these arguments or these statistics or even the history in an honest way. And certainly in the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, it's become almost verboten to discuss cause and effect, real cause and effect, and also, again, what kind of civilization you want, what kind of country you want. And we better think about that because I think we're in a fairly chaotic time, Shawn, not just in Canada, but around the world. And we better think about the kind of society we want. One of the other intros is our introductions are part of the chapter in the 1867 Project. In my last chapter there, I mentioned Justin Trudeau's famous 2015 comment that we're a post-nationalist country without any, he said something like, without any core identity or core whatever. And then he went on to contradict himself and say, but we have shared values. What do you mean, Mr. Prime Minister? Or do we not have some things that we have in common and should have in common? And the danger of that sort of nonsensical, silly thinking, really, by Justin Trudeau, is that, again, we're back to all ideas are equal. Everyone's welcome here. Yes, I'm pro-immigration. I think for the most part, multiculturalism is a decent thing. If by that you mean everyone should be welcome here, regardless of their ethnicity, what they look like, their faith or non-faith, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If by multiculturalism or by we're a post-nationalist state, you mean in the Trudeau sense that no idea is superior to others, that's a recipe, I think, for chaos. It's a recipe for disunity. There are a few core things that you need to unite around. Otherwise, again, literally, these are not the Prime Minister's words, but you would be okay if you take that very morally relativistic view, you'd be okay with a 75-year-old Afghan male emigrating here with his 5 wives and beating them if that's his value system. Obviously, that's not okay for most of us. So it's nonsensical of the Prime Minister in 2015 or now to try and pander to certain people because they hold views that we would think are, it's not even fair to the medieval age, which are simply brutal.
Yeah, I just wanted to read that quote that you keep referencing. It's on page 265 of your book. You're referring to Trudeau's comments in 2015 to the New York Times, and he said this, quote, "There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada. There are shared values, openness, respect, compassion, willingness to work hard, to be there for each other, to search for equality and justice. Those qualities are what make us the first post-national state," end quote.
Yeah, the arrogance of Justin Trudeau on that, for another reason as well. My PhD thesis was in anti-Americanism, and maybe I'll get around to producing that in a book one day. But when you think back to what was probably one of the more multicultural cities, and that probably grappled with these issues long before anyone else, think of New York 100 years ago, right? Back when Toronto was pretty white, pretty Presbyterian and Anglican and not much else, right? And Catholics were a minority. And they were probably the troublesome minority for the Protestants in Ontario at that point 100 years ago. So the notion that we're the first post-nationalist state, no, actually, again, I think there are cities around the world like New York, like London, that beat, say, Toronto, or any of our cities to at least a multicultural reality. And again, multicultural in the good sense, not in the no value should trump another sense.
Yeah. So the other thing that jumped to mind when you're saying we have to actually be honest, and it's not kind to be dishonest, I remember sharing this with someone I looked up to in medical politics 20 years ago, and I was saying, oh, this seems mean. We're being nasty. And he said this to me. He said, Shawn, politics is not a tea party. And
Well,
yeah, so we have to be honest, but at the same time, we don't need to go out of our way to be mean. But yeah, great answer to
no,
the.
and I don't think, obviously there's, in terms of how you express it, it may be perceived as mean, but it's not the duty, I think, of a think tank where I work and what we're trying
No.
to do of an analyst, or even a writer like Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens might have been perceived as mean by people of faith, but his view was very much an atheist view, and he was critical of Islam on some levels. He wrote a book that I actually thought was a bit mean on Mother Teresa, and actually to Mother Teresa, to put it mildly. Nonetheless, I actually think he was a pretty decent thinker most days, and I thought he was an excellent writer. And
He was entertaining.
yeah, he was entertaining, and so I think he was mostly honest, not always. I think he was tougher on, say, Christianity than Islam, believe it or not, probably because given some of the radicals out there, the most radical wing of Islam, not putting all Muslims into this category. Let's keep in mind that there are plenty of Muslims who disagree, as I just mentioned, with the theocracies in Iran and Afghanistan, plenty of expat Iranians in Canada who will tell you they don't like the theocracy or the fundamentalists, as will other Muslims. Anyway, but I think Hitchens understood he could face quite a fate if he was perhaps too blunt on matters of faith. For some, very devout, or in some cases, politically radicalized Muslims, if I can put it that way. But you get this problem in human history, by the way. It's not just a religious thing.
Sure.
You know, in the 20th century, much of the world was captured by communist atheists. They weren't exactly kind to their civilizations. Look at Stalin, look at Mao. They had a certain vision of the world, again, utopian, if you understand, you would understand that if everyone is listening and watching understands that word properly. You had 20th century atheists who had a pretty determined view of how the world should work, and they would fit people into it come hell or high water or blood. So there is a problem with people who have a certain view and are trying to fit the other 8 billion of us into it.
And to your point, no one accuses them of being provocative or mean. Anyways, I wanted to jump one chapter forward because you did mention immigration, and I wanted to bring this up too in chapter 19. The title is Ideas, Immigrants, and the Future of Canada. I want to read two very short quotations here on page 252, very bottom. Quote, given the importance of ideas and immigration, it is worthwhile to examine the flow of both, end quote. And then I'm going to pick up on page 253. In the middle of a very long sentence, it says this, quote, a nation state must unite diverse people around a conception of the good life and must agree on a way to govern itself. Making such decisions necessitates some minimum agreement on what the good life and good government means and how it is actualized in policy, end quote. Are you trying to push your vision of the good life on me, Dr. Milke?
Probably. Look, I what is developed in the West, the Anglosphere more particularly, I would argue, but the notion of property rights, which arrived with the Magna Carta in 1215, the notion that the king is not divine, which the English figured out in 1688 when they made sure that the king was subject to Parliament, and thus to some of the voters, to the voters of the population at that point. The separation of church and state, which again you can trace to influences in the dominant Western religion, Christianity, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, to God what is God's, that sort of thing. Or Martin Luther pushing back against the Catholic Church in the 1500s, which allowed for religious pluralism and a religious split, which also spilled over into politics eventually, which created the modern possibility for freedom as we know it today of the individual to dissent not only from the church, but from the state, right? And the notion that the individual is outside of the state, right? And has rights that are prior to the state, something even Pierre Trudeau very much understood, in which I quote in the in the 1867 project. So yes, to some degree, I am making a case for what's known as historic classical liberalism, which developed in the West. John Stuart Mill, the notion of liberty, or Mary Wollstonecraft on the rights of women. Now again, these days, these are virtues, these are ideas that many people around the world subscribe to, even if they're not Western in origin. So go to South Korea. They just deposed a president who tried to, abrogate the Constitution there or declare martial law, I forget which, several months ago, because they liked the right to exist without an autocrat or wherever he was headed. South Koreans and the Japanese, I spent 2 years in Japan, I'm familiar with it. other countries around the world, from Chile to Africa. Nelson Mandela fought back against the apartheid, the racism of the apartheid state, based on the notion that the individual has rights and those should not be subsumed because of skin color. So these things are widespread around the world, and you don't have to be European in origin or family history to like the idea. So I think it's been a very positive development, these notions of individual rights, the rights of women, the notion of equality of opportunity, but not result, because that's a different thing. Those are wonderful ideas, as is a free economy, which Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand. You're old enough to remember, Shawn, but some of us spent part of the 20th century arguing that other countries around the world should be market economies. That was much of the 20th century, especially after 1945 and against the Soviet Union, that countries and the individuals in them needed to be free to choose, as Milton Friedman famously wrote with his wife.
Great book.
In a book to that effect. The point was markets, open markets would allow people in societies, countries to flourish and prosper. And they did. And weirdly, we're into the soup right now, or people seem to have forgotten that. I digress. But these are property rights, the rights of the individual in law and policy to be treated as an individual in law and policy and not be discriminated against because one is female or one is the wrong religion in a society, whatever that happens to be. These are useful ideas which anyone can share if they choose and value if they choose. But the problem today is we're actually retreating from that ideal of what's called classical liberalism.
Brilliant setup for my question I've been dying to ask you, because a lot of my classical liberal friends are, I think, struggling with this same issue. I've been calling myself a conservative just recently. I'm more of a libertarian by nature and by background, mostly in response to government-run healthcare. But now I'm reluctantly starting to say maybe there's more than just libertarianism to the world. And so that's why I'm calling myself a reluctant conservative. But my classical liberal friends are articulating, not as well as you just did, but many of the things that they love about our culture, our society, that they love about the West. However, it seems as though, we'll call it the left, we'll call it progressives, have figured out how to use those values, those things that you talked about, for example, freedom, liberty, as a weapon. They've weaponized it against the liberal institutions that you love and I think that you're working to defend. And so I'll tie that into Jamal Javani's comments here. He wrote a chapter on his experience as a Black Canadian in the media industry. And now is he in federal parliament now, or is he still waiting?
He is now a member of parliament, yes, I believe, yes.
Yeah. So on page 195, he says this, quote, "Imposing an ideological racial purity test on Black men and women is wrong. It is censure. It is divide and conquer," end quote. He goes on, and then he talks about how the Globe and Mail was inviting Black writers, but they're insisting on capitalizing the letter B, which he took issue with. And then he says this, quote, "But how much does any of that matter if your paper is going to insist that Black people are supposed to think and say the same things? What kind of agenda is a news outlet supporting if it is narrowly defining an entire demographic by what Twitter activists say? So let me be clear. My Blackness was not given to me by the Globe and Mail. God did that. No newspaper can take my Blackness from me. We can address anti-Black racism and provide hope to Black communities without demanding that Black people in positions of leadership parrot the left's unhelpful ideological talking points," end quote. Are you finding yourself forced to become more conservative about protecting your liberal institutions?
Maybe we should define what we mean, actually, Shawn, first. I think just your viewers and everyone else understands what I mean by liberalism. Classical liberalism, again, of the 19th century was John Stuart Mill on liberty, making a case when they're the only people that could vote for the most part were property males, making a case for equality before the law for Black Americans, or in the case of Mill in England, and so on and so forth. And for liberalism, that was very different, I think, than the post-1960s liberalism we've seen in Canada of Pierre Trudeau, for the most part, although on individual rights, Pierre Trudeau was a classical liberal, but not in much else. So I think there's a difference between the post-1960s liberalism of the West, whether it's the United States or Canada, and what came before. So what happened was liberals, in essence, dropped some of these classical liberal ideals and conservatives began to pick them up, right? Through the influence of Milton Friedman on the economy, through the influence of William F. Buckley on the rights of the individual. So today, at least until the Trump era, A conservative might be akin to a classic liberal like Wilfrid Laurier, who believed in the rights of the individual and believed in a free economy, so on and so forth. All the stuff, again, that post-1945 or even against Nazi Germany, the West fought for a free and open economy, and for the most part, for individuals to be treated as that, which is why we had civil rights reforms in the 1950s, and the Americans got around to it a bit later, as they always do, in the 1960s. So I'd make that distinction first between the liberalism that many people are familiar with now, and which is more of a progressive, as they put it, and I put that in quotes. I think it's regressive, but a progressive notion of what the state should be involved in. And this dates back again about a century at least to Woodrow Wilson and others, the progressive movement, which took some things from socialism and Marxism, but also just had an infatuation with the power of government to direct stuff from the top down, right? That, and their theory, simplistically put, but I think it's accurate, put enough tax dollars in the same room with some smart people and you can solve any problem, including private problems. I've always thought that's flawed. Not because you don't want experts at some point, but you want them connected to reality. And you can't solve every private problem. Let me give you a clear example. One of the things Jamil talks about in the 1867 project, as do others, it's been going on for 50 or 60 years, is the decline of the family, the fracturing of the family. And if you want to understand why, for example, Black Americans began to fall behind, even on education, where in some cases, some Black schools in the United States were very much the equal of white schools, say in Washington, D.C. Thomas Sowell famously found this out in some of his analysis and work. You have to look at the decline of the Black family and later the white family. And they've both been analyzed. In the case of the United States, despite the discrimination, the heavy discrimination against Black Americans before the Civil Rights era, as Thomas Sowell has found out, and as Jamil noted as well, you had some success, some rising living standards, some rising educational standards, because families were together. But the more the Black family fractured, you don't have two parents around to help teach your kid math. You have one. And again, nothing against single parents is good reason why sometimes people are sole parents. But if you don't look at other things that are causing outcomes, then you're not going to be, as we talked about a moment ago, honest about what may be the real problem. And then you may blame the wrong things for economic outcomes, among others. Long way of saying one of the things that needs to be understood today is that there are other things that matter in terms of economic outcomes, rather than just the alleged racism, which we hear about all the time today, or assumed institutional racism, which we got rid of in Canada 70 years ago. It's not the same thing as personal prejudice. But Jamil's chapter in the 1867 project does a wonderful job of pointing out that we must pay attention to these cultural and family factors that can have a negative effect upon people's future, kids' future, right? Thomas Sowell famously observed that what he found was if kids had a library card, didn't matter if they were Black or white, they'd have the same incomes 20 years later or whatever it was, and other sort of things that went into the family dynamic. So these are things we need to pay attention to as well.
Yeah, great answer. I need your help on how to respond then to my libertarian friends who say,
yes,
don't talk to me about good life. Don't talk to me about anything being better than we have 35 million versions or 40 million now versions of the good life in Canada.
Right.
How would you respond to that?
Right. And sorry, and I forgot. So we define what a liberal is, and a conservative in one sense. What's the old joke? A conservative is only liberal has been mugged by reality. At least in the, again, post-1960s version of a liberal, right? The Pierre Trudeaus, the Walter Mondales, the Jimmy Carters. The libertarian position, there's certainly a lot of overlap between classical liberalism and libertarianism.
Mm-hmm.
Part of me thinks, and one of the reasons I founded the Aristotle Foundation, which again is more Edmund Burke, organic change, that type of conservatism, right? Edmund Burke famously observing the French Revolution that you don't want to start from year zero. You get a lot of blood when you do that. You build in your society, you reform it slowly, a very English concept, very Burkean concept. That would be called conservative. Or again, the classical liberal approach, which is we prefer more freedom than might have been the case, which Edmund Burke didn't necessarily even disagree with, but he just thought change should come via reform, not revolution. Libertarians have a lot in common with classical liberals, I'd say. I get the sense, and I'm not a deep expert on this, despite a PhD in political science, that there's some libertarians, though, that, again, are not paying attention to some of the undercurrents. Maybe the best example of this is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who went from being a Muslim in Somalia, moved to Europe and then the United States, and I think is in the UK now, or maybe still in the United States, who went from Islam to atheism to Christianity. She argues that nature abhors a vacuum. I wonder if libertarians understand the power of deep belief, philosophical belief or religious belief. And I say that because I'm not sure you can unhook always a society from its philosophical or religious moorings. If you unhook China from if you try to, as Chairman Mao did, from its Confucian origins, you end up with a lot of blood in the streets as well. And so there's something about reform of an existing civilization. Anyway, libertarians in our context, Shawn, I wonder if they understand the power of some of these ideas in the way that they will lead to outcomes that they don't like. So let me be blunt. Again, if you look at Islam as a political project, and it doesn't have to be looked at that way, but you're a fundamentalist about it and a political fundamentalist at the same time in Iran or Afghanistan, those ideas matter. Some of the best work that has been done on this is by one of our senior fellows, Waller Newell, on tyrannies and terrorism. And he points out that, for example, the political project that is Iran since 1979 actually was born out of French thinkers. His argument is that Islam traditionally is not as political as we've seen since 1979 in Iran. His point being that the revolutionary aspect that you saw in 1979 and beyond in Iran, which Iran is trying to foment in the rest of the Arab world and perhaps around the world, really has its origins in French revolutionary thinkers of the last century, ironically. So he argues that that type of Islam is actually apostate. Now, I say all that to say again, ideas matter. And if libertarians don't pay attention to those things, they can come up with, I think, some simplistic notions sometimes. A clear example, I think, is on foreign affairs. I have some libertarian friends who would just say, the United States in particular, but all of us, we shouldn't intervene in other countries. That's really naive. When the wolf is at your door and eats your neighbor, he may come for you next. That's why I don't agree with Donald Trump. That's why I don't agree with J.D. Vance, the vice president. It was naive in the 1930s to think Adolf Hitler didn't want more. He did. He was clear about that. It was naive to think he wasn't going to kill Jews. He made that clear from the 1920s onward. So we live in an age where people like to live by slogans, and I don't think it's terribly helpful. The reality, and this again is why we founded the Aristotle Foundation, pay attention to reality. It's almost an empirical project, which is also why we named it after Aristotle. Aristotle cared about what was happening on the ground, unlike Plato, who had ideas that were derived from the sky. If you're a libertarian who thinks you, as an American citizen or an American republic or other countries, can simply ignore what's happening on your borders, it may be too late when the wolf comes for you. And that's simply a human reality. Some human beings seek power above all else. And Lord Acton certainly understood it. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is what's happened to Vladimir Putin, who has gained absolute power because he wanted it, got a taste of some initial power, and then wanted the rest. This is very dangerous for human beings. And one of my fundamental beliefs, and it also you'll see in some of the Aristotle Foundation work we do, is that we need to pay attention not just to the efficiency arguments, which, for example, I agree with, traditional economists in the 20th century, free market economists who I completely agree with, and others, including libertarians. It's a very libertarian thing to be a free market economist. Are absolutely right. You want to look at what's the most efficient way to do something, but you can't stop there, in my view. As a political scientist, and my PhD was in political philosophy and international relations, you also have to encounter the problem of power. What I mean by that is the early American founders understood that, again, Lord Acton, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The American founders understood that you didn't want one institution or one person to have all the power, which is why they designed their system the way it's designed. House of Representatives versus the Senate versus the White House. Some people think that's inefficient. It is. It's deliberately inefficient because they didn't want one person or institution to have all the power cards, so to speak. And I don't want to generalize. Some libertarians understand that, but whether it's the problem of power and not just looking at efficiencies alone, but making sure no one has all the cards, power cards, or naivety about foreign affairs and the wolves out there, that's probably where I would not be a libertarian, even though I pretty much am on the market and, again, what individuals can or should do. But I think you have to account for the power of ideas too, including religious and philosophical ideas in history, to make sure you lose the classical liberalism, which, broadly speaking, conservatives, classical liberals, some modern day liberals, not enough, and libertarians share.
So I've been repeating this to a number of people. I think Louis Armstrong said, if you ask me for a definition of jazz, he said, you're never going to understand jazz. So there's a real problem with definitions. Having said that, I think having the discussion around these definitions is still important. I have a hypothesis that conservatism and liberalism are not the same thing, but not with a view to creating a purity test. That was Tom Flanagan's term. He says, we don't need a purity test here, but the work of Aristotle Foundation is to digging into these ideas, and it sounded like you're riffing off Montesquieu and separation of powers.
Yeah,
And,
I am, and just all the thinking that went into that, but also, and you're right about liberalism and conservatism are not the same. Another way to think about liberalism, again, the pre-1960s version, is that is an ideas-based kind of philosophy. Again, the rights of the individuals and where that all came from. Versus conservatism, you can see it's almost an orientation. The Edmund Burke, I prefer reform. He was open to ideas and change, and in fact argued you needed to be open to that lest you get a revolution like they had in France. You resist new ideas or reform, you get the revolutionaries because the pot boils over. So one is almost more of an orientation, a conservative disposition, whereas one really is, ideology is a bad word, but it's a system of ideas that said, here is why people should be free. That was classical liberalism.
Yeah. And I think liberalism served society well after World War II because it emphasized a thin philosophy. Let's just work on the bare minimum. We're going to get along. We're not going to talk about all these richer, deeper ideas because we're so scared of war and divisions and we don't want to fight. Let's just all get along. However, I think that post-war liberal era has come to an end, and more people are talking, like you've been talking, saying, you know what? Politics is not a tea party. Geopolitics is a real thing, and there are enemies, and there are people that don't want to be nice to us, and so it means we have to actually have ideas about foreign powers. Is that something that is now representative of the end of the post-war liberal era? Because up until the 1990s, other than the Soviet Union, who we were always in contest with, there seemed to be a good several decades where, no, let's just all get along and we're going to have national trade and multinational corporations, and whether it was the financial crisis of 2008 or Trump's election or Brexit or COVID, it seems like a whole bunch of dominoes have fallen where people now are saying, hang on a second, yeah, there are some old ideas about geopolitics that are relevant now. Ukraine war, October 7th,
Well, it depends on the ideas, and relevant they may be, but are they in touch with reality? Part of what I think has happened to liberalism is not just its infection of socialism economically in the 1960s and forward, right, which led to a lot of problems in the West. Again, the notion that government should do everything, and that really the end state should be a very highly socialist state, interventionist state, as Pierre Trudeau wanted, and others around the world, or even a Marxist state, as others wanted. There's not just that problem in terms of what happened to liberalism. I would say that the other thing that's happened in our world in the last 70 or 80 years, it's one thing to be a liberal again in the classic sense in the 1950s and say, women should be able to divorce easier because they might be married to an abusive spouse. That's a liberal idea, that women should be able to do this, right? And they shouldn't be subject to men. They should have equal rights. That's in the context of the 1950s and 1960s. It's a mistake, though, to see every sort of progressive idea that's been latched, again, the progressives and the economic Marxists who took over liberalism, I would argue, in the 60s and 70s. It's a mistake to look at every self-described progressive idea as a continuation of earlier civil rights struggles. What I mean by that is, let's take a very clear one today, transgender. I don't think it's the transgender movement is simply an extension of the Black civil rights movement, of feminism, certainly, and other movements for the rights of minorities. In part because I think you define people as individuals, not as minorities, but it's a question of reality. And what has happened with the transgender movement, I think, is they've taken, for example, the gay rights movement and said, we're just like the gay rights movement. No, if you're in denial that some men and women are gay, I would argue that's a denial of reality. If someone, though, who looks like you says, I'm a woman, and you haven't had a sex change yet, Shawn, I'm going to go, I think that's honestly a denial. And you forced me to say that, as the University of Toronto wanted to do to Jordan Peterson 7-8 years ago. That's a denial of reality and an empiricism. And you're forcing me to deny my senses. Now, maybe my senses are wrong. Maybe my eyes are screwed up and you're different than I'm seeing you. But nonetheless, that caveat aside, I think, for example, what's happened with transgender ideas is that there's been this combination of this traditional, very Western idea that we can be anything we want and should be able to be free to be whoever we want to be. Yes, you can. But if you think you can fly without wings and you're a human being, you will crash. And so you can't deny reality. And back to the Aristotle Foundation, what we're trying to do at the Aristotle Foundation is say, you may have certain ends or certain ideas. They really should be based in reality because you can harm not only yourself, but others. And we need to make that distinction. So again, with Some of the transgender debates, I'm not in denial that there may be some people who have gender dysphoria. I'm no expert in. I assume some do. I'm just really quite cautious to say that we should be handing out hormone blocking drugs to 13-year-old girls who don't know their own mind or body yet. So to me, that's a denial of reality. But we've had a problem with progressivism taking on ideas, I think, that are fundamentally anti-reality. But frankly, and things are not easily divided into left or right or progressive versus conservative or liberal these days. Things are so messed up because of Donald Trump. I'm a free marketer. I'm a free trader. Donald Trump is not a conservative if you define conservatism as free markets. I think he's in deep denial of reality, that open trading, not with China who cheats and steals your patent, with other Western liberal democracies and other democracies around the world, or other economies that mostly are free traders and fair traders in that sense. I think Donald Trump is utterly wrong and doesn't understand how the world came to be today. And both him and the vice president are blaming the wrong things for some of the ills they think they spot in the United States. So really, I think what people should ask themselves these days to get past the labels and all of this is, am I in touch with reality? Is the idea proffered by a politician or someone else in touch with reality? I was reading something from Paul Johnson, you may know, the famous British historian who died some years ago, a book called Intellectuals. And the quote, which I'll paraphrase, is something to the effect of, once the priestly class lost its power over the last couple centuries, intellectuals took over. And they've been given a new knighthood almost by the public until recently, that intellectuals. But it's part of this progressive hubris that from the top down, you can organize society, and you can't, at least on most things. You can set the general course, we're going to go to war, but then you better listen to your generals who know something about how to conduct a war, right? You may want retirement security for people. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to run all the retirement programs. Or you're in healthcare, the problem of intellectuals at the top or power from the top. We do want universal healthcare. What you don't want is a very rigid system that doesn't allow you to cover everyone, but in a way that inherently has competitive forces that compete for the best outcomes, which we don't have in Canada. Is better than anyone.
So, Mark, you're dangling too many shiny objects in front of me. You said Trump, free trade, and healthcare, and I have to be disciplined. I've been staring at the title of your latest book, The Victim Cult, just over to the side of your head there for the last 40 minutes. And I've been dying to ask you about it. Maybe you could tell us about that. I want to put a picture of it up on the screen, and you can tell me why you wrote it and what's it about.
I don't cover transgender politics in the book, in The Victim Cult. That was just an example from the previous diversion down a garden path. But The Victim Cult, this actually came up as a result of some of the policy work I'd done on Aboriginal issues over the years. And I grew up in Kelowna, British Columbia, near a very successful First Nation, the West Bank First Nation, who treated much of the land there as if it was private property, in the sense they leased it out to many non-Indigenous folk and still do on 99-year leases. It's made the West Bank First Nation very successful. There's still elements of what's there that I disagree with in terms of governance. They, and also the person who wrote the foreword to the Victim Cult, Ellis Ross, who comes from the Haisla First Nation in British Columbia and took them from poverty to prosperity by working with natural gas companies. Both of those are examples of very successful First Nations. But in my policy career, I've come across many chiefs of some First Nations that are mired in the past, blame everything on colonialism, as we hear a lot about today, including some of the commissions that we've had in the last 10 years. And that was the prompt for the book. I was familiar enough with this victim narrative. And it always occurred to me it's dangerous because it traps you in the past and you don't look to the future. But there's more to it than that. You may get things wrong if you look at the past. You may not actually always have the proper cause and effect, as we've discussed a little bit today. But the Victim Cult was really about this danger of chronic victim thinking and getting stuck there. Most of your viewers will be familiar with Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany, who claimed they were victims of the Versailles Treaty. And Adolf Hitler and others really riffed off on this, you could say, in the 1920s and into the 1930s. I disagree with that interpretation by Germans of the time. But if you understand, and most people may not, the 19th century, Germans already thought they were victims. And they were victims of the French, who in the late 18th century had occupied parts of Germany. Germans in the 19th century are trying to recreate what it means to be German. And what do people do when they've been victimized? They begin to look for their identity. If you recreate it on, say, a positive basis, what Germans did is they looked at everyone, English liberals, Jews, the French, of course, and others, as their perennial oppressors. And it led them to be very ensconced in a victim narrative long before they got to race purity, that nonsensical anti-science, pseudoscientific idea. Germans in the 19th century were very much about cultural purity. What do we hear today around the world, Shawn? that your culture, if we only respect your culture, this gets back to where we started. What if I don't like your culture? What if I think it's illiberal? What if I think it's oppressive to women? Anyway, the victim cult was about the danger of getting stuck in a victim narrative. And sometimes the victim narratives are true. Victims are created every day, unfortunately, by acts of God, nature. Someone harms someone else. So the book is not about a denial of victimhood, but be very careful in getting stuck in victimhood, even if your story is true, because that may prevent you from moving on as a country, for example. A lot of my examples are civilizational in countries, whether it's Rwanda, where there's great victimhood on the part of the majority Hutus, and that led to 30 years of discrimination against the minority Tutsis and eventually a massacre, a genocide. So the victim cult is about the danger of getting stuck in a narrative. And I have mild, medium, what I call mild, moderate, and murderous examples in the victim cult of this danger.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I look forward to finishing that book. I've only started the beginning of it, and I apologize I didn't have quotes to read you from it. I always ask everybody at the end of, as we're rounding down towards the end of the show, what am I not asking? What should I be asking, Dr. Milke? What are Canadians not thinking about that we need to be thinking about?
Sure, and I should have said, just call me Mark, Shawn. We've known each other for a long time. What should we be thinking about these days? I think, look, I think we live in an anti-reality, anti-reason, anti-responsibility age. One of the things we haven't talked about, and I meant to also go into this, again, if the history of liberalism and emphasizing rights has been a good emphasis in the last 2 centuries. However, at some point, we've also crossed some weird Rubicon where we emphasize rights, not wrongly. Again, I believe in the rights of the individual in law and policy, and sometimes we've backtracked on that. I don't like discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or whatever, including affirmative action, including DI, and so forth. I think it's anti-individual. So I do think we need to always remember where the rights should be anchored and centered in the individual and law and policy. But I think people have also overdosed in this sense. They also forget that a rights-based society needs responsible people as well. I was in Japan for 2 years. And I remember a story there in the newspaper. I think it was about someone in Vancouver who backed into someone. It was an elderly lady who backed into someone. This person sued the elderly lady for all they were worth. I remember the writer in Japan, and she came from Canada, which is why she paid attention to Canadian news. She said, this would never happen in Japan. You would understand this was an accident. You wouldn't sue the person for all they're worth and put them into poverty, as apparently happened to this elderly lady in Canada when she was sued by the person she accidentally drove over. What does that speak to? The necessity of responsibility and community. And there's other examples. I think responsibility must go along with the rights culture. So a lot of people, and this is why I wrote the victim cult. If you claim to be a victim all the time and you don't want to contribute to society because you think you're a permanent victim, even if you were, that can be dangerous. And a clear example I give at the end of the victim cult is those of East Asian origin, or ethnicity rather, in Canada and the United States, horribly discriminated against for a century, from about 1850 to 1950, when there was Asian migration to the United States and Canada. It began around the 1850s in the case of the United States, and a little bit later in Canada. Horrible discrimination for much of that period. Nonetheless, they did the right thing. They fought back politically where they could. They went to the courts where they could, won some, lost some. But even in the most discriminatory period in the 1920s in the United States, for example, you'll find that the data shows those of Chinese ancestry, Japanese ancestry in the United States were educating their kids to a great degree, more so than white Americans. Like the graduation rates were higher, the attendance at university was higher. What did this do? It set the groundwork really for what we know today, which is a cliche, which is East Asian Canadians, East Asian Americans, to use the hyphenations, have among the highest incomes in both countries. Why? High education levels, high levels of entrepreneurship, which is another factor. It's not like Asian Americans and Asian Canadians were not discriminated against. They were. It's not like they weren't victimized. They were. And again, they fought back where they could, and in some cases succeeded, in some cases didn't until the 1950s. But they refused to allow the victimization to permanently define them, is the best way to put it. And it's a wonderful example of how to push back against real victimization and yet set the stage for future success, at least in a liberal democracy.
Yeah, brilliant. That's a nice way to bring it all together. So I'm certain we could go on for another hour easily. You have so many stats and stories and anecdotes at front of mind. I want everybody to check out the Aristotle Foundation. I loved your recent study that you did on DEI. Check out Dr. Milke's books, at least the last 2 books that I've talked about. I don't know all the other titles, but if they're as good as your last 2 books, I'm sure they'll be provocative as well. Mark, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Shawn. Anytime.
Good pleasure. Don't forget to sign up and share this show. Thanks so much.